No, no buzz. It just beats book club. They talking the city on its uncertain walls. The new Murakami, the first in 11 years or however long it's been. 6 years, I guess, since IQ84, I guess. I'm assuming. No, colorist Tsukuru Tazaki, right? That would have been his last novel. He's had some short story collections and maybe one nonfiction thing come out since then, but it's the first big novel. I read it. It had been about 6 years since I read one of his novels. I read Tsukuru Tazaki like right when it came out, and in the subsequent 6 years, my estimation of Murakami as a writer has sort of, I wouldn't say plummeted, but he went from a writer who I was very much anticipating everything he wrote up until IQ84, which I read and liked at the time. And then I think A Strange Library came out, and that was like a weird little nice edition that I got, in the late 2000s, I guess. And then Tazaki came out, and I was like, this is kind of just him. Then I had a lot of conversations with people over the years, and was just like, yeah, Murakami has certain quirks that are like not the best. Especially around writing women. And I kind of was like, I think I'm done. I think I existed in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, and he was very impactful for me at the time. And I think I'm 36 years old, and I'm good on Murakami. And then this art came into my place of work, and I was like, what if like one more time? What if one last encore to just be done with it? And that's feels about right for me and Murakami. City in its uncertain walls, story of a dude who like falls in love with a girl when he's 17 and she's 16. They live in neighboring towns. They see each other every once in a while. They make out occasionally. When it cuts to much later in his life, um, when she has disappeared into what he presumes is the place that she has talked about repeatedly as this presumably magical space, where she claims the real her exists. It's a city that is entirely surrounded by a very high and completely impenetrable wall that is filled with these unicorn like creatures, and very sort of insular. One day, when he's much older, he steps into a hole and wakes up outside that city, gets his job that she prescribed for him as the dream reader, which involved altering his eyes, and sort of finds her there. She's the same age as she was when they knew each other many years before. And then some more shit happens. Having a nice conversation with a housemate who mentioned that back when we were both huge Murakami people, that they had encountered a lot of discussion around the question of Murakami and translation specifically, and the way that, at least in the conversations that they remembered, that there was sort of a split between people who liked, well, there wasn't so much a split as that people sort of associate Murakami's style in English with the J. Rubin novels, the translations by J. Rubin, and the sort of lesser novels tend to be the ones that are translated by Philip Gabriel. This is a Philip Gabriel translation, and the thing they mentioned, having remembered, was that that Gabriel tends to be a much more literal translator of Murakami, whereas Rubin sort of tends to take more um, liberties with the translation to translate in the spirit rather than necessarily by the letter. Is maybe a better way to say that. And that in some ways, like the English speaking reception to Murakami is very much shaped by Rubin's more spiritual translations than literal ones. Um, I thought it was interesting. I didn't really go deep into it, and I'm sure there has been 30 years worth of discourse around this and its pros and cons that people have very different feelings about. But I see that broadly there are novels that are translated more in the style of the city and its uncertain walls, which seem very unembellished, very much happy to repeat certain things. I don't know if I can just find one off top. Um, this is like a more artistic one than usual, but reading from the end of chapter 7 and like literally the last two sentences of chapter 7, right? I inhaled the night air deeply, searching for the right words, the appropriate expression. And finally I said, people there all have shadows with them. Or beginning of chapter 8. That's right. People there all had shadows with them. Me and you, we each had a shadow. And that's like at least a bit of creative reinterpretation of what happens a number of times. Um, and there's a continuity that happens across chapter openings that I can see why you would translate it that way. Um, but there are at least three, probably more like five instances I remember hitting. I didn't like mark down in any way where the last sentence of a chapter is literally the first sentence of the next chapter. And it doesn't make sense to me in terms of material production because, from what I understand, um, The City and Its Uncertain Walls was a story that Murakami had published in like 1980, I want to say. Yeah, because it was 40 years later that he revisited it. He published a or like a novella, basically, in a Japanese magazine, and it doesn't, as I recall, it doesn't seem like it was published in installments. I guess if it was published in installments, that would make a ton more sense. But he published this novella, and he says, sort of in his afterword, that it was something that he had never allowed to be collected in any of his previous works because he knew it was unfinished in some way or other. And then he says that in 2020, he was like, "It's been 40 years since I touched that thing. I need to look at it again." And then coronavirus pandemic happens, and so he's isolated. Although Japan's response to coronavirus was like not very sustained, let's say. Um, from people who were there at the time or were Japanese speakers and following it, seems like the response was pretty bad, honestly. No U.S. levels, probably, of course, but the sense of isolation, I think, and the 40 intervening years, I guess, allowed Murakami to sort of sit with the thing and spend a couple years writing, like rewriting it slash fleshing it out into the novel form that it is currently. So yeah, material production. I don't think it was a serialized thing. I think it was just like a novella that he published in a magazine that he then expanded upon. So I don't really know why there's just repeated moments where the chapter ends with a sentence and the next chapter begins with the exact same sentence. Again, if I was a Murakami partisan like I was 10, 15 years ago, I would point immediately to, just flipping through this, right? Like I said, uh, the first, the end of chapter 7 is that line that I just read. And finally I said, people there all have shadows with them. That's right. And then beginning of chapter 8 is, that's right. People there all had shadows with them. Me and you, we each had a shadow. And that's, I think, like I said, maybe the best example of this in the book. Because it's not just a repetition. It is reframing who is being spoken to, right? Um, it's switching perspectives. It is doing things alongside the repetition. And again, like if I was a partisan, I would then flip to the beginning of chapter 9, where like the end of chapter 8, this is where the story reaches a crazy climax, and that's where you appear in a minor role, blah blah blah. So I never did learn what kind of supporting role I played in it, and probably never will. And the beginning of chapter 9 is, it's true that people there all have shadows with them. So like there is a thing happening with repetition of language that occurs structurally in similar points across chapters. This is a book that has a lot of very short chapters. It's in 3 parts. So when I said what I think is was going to happen here did happen here, is what I'm doing right now, right? I may be belaboring the ways in which this novel is more interesting than I found it, because there are a lot of things that are just not particularly interesting or advancing of anything I found aesthetically fascinating or edifying in Murakami 15 years ago. It feels very much stuck in the same moment he's been stuck in for basically his entire career, which for me is the mid 2000s. Obviously, that's not true of him chronologically, but all of his stuff feels like of a certain moment, even when it's wildly different, right? And I'm not. If I was going through and reading him in publication order, I would be doing a much better job of periodizing things, et cetera, et cetera. But like the vibe is not shifted in a way that made me go, cool. I have had my time with the novels of Murakami. If a 16-year-old who kind of needs a push out of just pure nihilist Western literature were to ask me if there was a Murakami novel to read, I would be like, yeah, go read Cock on the Shore for sure. Go read Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Hopefully that'll bring you over to Yokogawa or fucking Kenzaburo Oe or um, uh, Jesus Christ, I was literally just looking for her book today at the library and they didn't have it. Kawakami or maybe you or like, a lot of folks who have been doing a bunch of really good work, and then beyond that to other things. Um, I do think that there's a place for Murakami in in a sort of curriculum, I guess. But the place for me in my life is in the past until maybe I get very nostalgic. But I don't really feel like that's gonna happen. Kind of don't really fuck with nostalgia personally. But because you're a bee, or else you wouldn't be here, right? Right? Thanks for not watching.